Genesis 6 is a kind of a bizarre passage. It's really kind of weird to the way we look at the world today. But before we really dive into this, let's just kind of think a little bit about the things we've seen so far. We saw creation in Genesis 1, and the things I want to emphasize there are the fact that God created all things, and He created human beings in His own image, and because of the fact that we're created in His image, we are all worthy of dignity and value because we are created in the very image of God. God gave one command, and that was to not eat of the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And our first parents, Adam and Eve, partook of that fruit. They ate. That's bringing sin into the world and death through sin. Then we saw particularly in verse 15, chapter 3, after they ate of the tree, God gave a promise and a curse. He cursed the serpent, stating that it would crawl around on its belly. He cursed the ground, saying that it would produce thorns and thistles any longer. But He did not curse human beings. Instead, he did lay out what the consequences were of sin. There would be a distortion of the relationships that man and woman would have. There would be increased pain in childbearing, and there would be increased pain and labor and toil in our work. But there is a promise that is given as well. A promise of the seed of the woman that would one day come. God says that there would be a seed of the woman, a descendant of Eve, who would come and crush the serpent's head one day. And that place in Genesis 3 is the foundation of a messianic hope. Throughout the Old Testament, they were looking forward to a Messiah, this one who was promised right after the fall, who would come and crush the serpent's head. And the whole Old Testament points forward to Jesus, the one who would come, the one who was a descendant of David, the one who was a descendant of Abraham, the one who was a descendant of Eve, the seed of the woman who came. Last week, we looked at chapter 5. We looked at the genealogy, all the names, and he died, over and over again. The consequences of sin were spreading while there was a fruitfulness. Adam and Eve did have children, and each generation continued to have children, and they were being fruitful and multiplying at the same time. Every generation since then, and we know it in our experience, everyone dies. But you come to Noah, and Noah's father, when he is born, says, this one, he calls him Noah because Noah means rest, and this one, he says, will bring us relief from the painful toil of our hands. There's an expectation, maybe this is the one. Maybe this is the one who will be the deliverer. Maybe this is the one who will be the Messiah. Now, Noah, he points forward to Jesus and the fact that he did save the world and the fact that he built an ark. He believed God, and it was credited to him as righteousness. He believed God, and he made the ark as God told him to do. And that saved all of humanity since that time. But leading up to that, here we have in chapter 6 this bizarre passage that tells us about things that happen in this pre-flood world that we just look at it and say it's bizarre. And as I begin to talk about it, as I begin to explain it, we'll understand what I mean by bizarre. Beginning in verse 1, I'll read our text. When man began to multiply on the face of the earth and had daughters who were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of man were attractive, and they took as their wives any they chose. Then the Lord said, my spirit shall not abide in man forever, for he is flesh. His days shall be 120 years. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterwards. When the sons of God came into the daughters of man, and they bore children to them, these were the mighty men who were of old, the men of renown. The Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intention of the thoughts of the heart of his heart was only evil continually. And the Lord regretted that he had made man upon the earth, and it grieved him to his heart. So the Lord said, I will blot out man that I have created from the face of the land, man and animals and creeping things and birds of the heavens, for I am sorry that I have made them. But Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. Let's pray. Oh, Father, we love you. Father, we pray that you would speak to us from your word. Open our eyes and open our ears so that we can hear from you, and Lord, that we can live in obedience to your truth. Father, give me strength tonight. Strengthen me as I'm already worn out from a long day of ministry. Father, give me strength to preach your word in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay, so we begin. When man began to multiply on the face of the earth, this harkens back to what the original command to Adam and Eve was. He commanded Adam and Eve, be fruitful and multiply. And we saw in chapters 4 and 5 how that was obeyed, that the human race began to continue, and they multiplied on the face of the earth. Now, at this time, it tells us that the sons of God saw that the daughters of man were attractive, and they took as their wives any they chose. Now, here is where I'm saying is bizarre. What is the sons of God and the daughters of man? What is it talking about in this passage here? There are a couple of different interpretations that I think that are possible. But it's hard to say with certainty because this is just a really difficult passage. Some have held that this is the godly line of Seth is the sons of God, and that the wicked line of Cain was the daughters of man, and that they intermarried, and this was one of the reasons that led to the flood, led to the destruction of all humanity. But the other view is that these sons of God that came down and were that married human women. The other view is that those were angelic beings, like they were fallen angels. And now you should understand that's pretty bizarre. That sounds pretty bizarre. But here are the reasons why that is probably the oldest position, the most ancient position on what this text means. First of all, every place in the Old Testament where we see the word the sons of God, it's referring to angelic beings outside of this text. We see it in the book of Job. It only occurs a few times in the whole Old Testament. We see it in the book of Job. If you know the story of the book of Job, about how in the very beginning, where those who are reading the book of Job get to see behind the curtain, kind of like in the Wizard of Oz, getting to see behind the curtain at what's going on, where Job doesn't really know what's going on in the story. But behind the curtain, we get a glimpse, and we see that it says, at that time, the sons of God would come before the Lord, and Satan also would come with them. So that was at the time whenever Satan asked permission, to be able to give trials to Job. So here we see the sons of God were angelic beings. Another place also in the book of Job, we see the same term, the sons of God, about how they rejoiced at creation. This was the rejoicing at when God was making all of the heavens and the earth and everything. And this was not talking about human beings, but this would be talking about the hosts of heaven that were rejoicing at the time of creation. Then also, we see in the book of Daniel, there's the Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego, the story there of the three Hebrew children that were thrown into the fiery furnace. These three children were, I call them children, that's, I guess, out of tradition. These three men were thrown into the fiery furnace, and Nebuchadnezzar looks down into the furnace, and he sees, he says, weren't there four? There's four men down there. Didn't we just throw three? Didn't we just throw three down there into the fire? And the fourth is like the Son of God, right? He was saying that fourth one, he doesn't look like just any old person. He looks like some kind of angelic being, some kind of heavenly being, someone who came right out of heaven. So those are the places that we see this term "son of God," sons of God in the Old Testament, and each one refers to like angelic type beings. And so it would be natural that when we come to Genesis chapter 6 and we read, when the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were attractive, they took as their wives any they chose. When we read that, it would seem natural with the context of the rest of the Old Testament that we would be talking about angelic beings who left their dwelling in heaven, who came down, were tempted, and had marriages with human women. Now, that seems bizarre to me, and that seems bizarre to any of us, but I think that's really the position that the biblical writers held, and the New Testament writers also talk about the same thing. In the New Testament, we see in 2 Peter, the passage that I read for our scripture reading, it talked about how in the ancient world, God held the angels who disobeyed until judgment, and it contrasted that with the fact that with Noah, he saved from destruction. Those were side by side, just as we see it here. God holding angels for judgment. Now, where else in the Old Testament do we see a story like that? Is there any place we see in the Old Testament where there's these angels that are held for judgment? I think the only place that it would be, I think, would be this passage. It's talking about those angels who left their proper dwelling. And I'm saying that left their proper dwelling because that's the way that the book of Jude puts it. In the book of Jude, it uses the same kind of example about how God is able to punish the wicked and also save the righteous from the midst of that punishment. He uses the same example of Noah in the ancient world in contrast to these angels who left their proper dwelling and went after sensuality. So all that to say, I think the text of the Bible points to the idea that is what happened. That angels, that fallen angels, left heaven and intermarried with human women. Now, you might say, well, how is that possible whenever Jesus said, well, in the resurrection, we'll be like the angels. We'll be like the angels, neither given in marriage, or neither marrying nor given in marriage. How is that going to be if Jesus says that the angels don't marry? Well, it says that we'll be like the angels in heaven when Jesus says that. But here, Jude tells us they left their proper dwelling. They were not angels in heaven. They had fallen. And so that's one way that we can reconcile those two to where that fits. So, now, I'll warn you right now, this is a difficult passage. So I may struggle along the way as I'm trying to explain this. Verse 3, we come to this right after Moses, the author here, talks about these fallen angels who came and intermarried with human women. It says, then the Lord said, my spirit shall not abide in thee, in man forever. For he is flesh, his days shall be 120 years. And we think back to last week whenever we looked at the genealogy and how people lived for so many years. We had Methuselah, who lived 969 years. We had my namesake, Jerry. He lived 962 years. We had Adam that lived over 900 years. The youngest person in the entire genealogy was Enoch, and he's the one who was taken and did not die, according to the text. He lived to be 365 years. But here, because of the wickedness, because of the spread of sin and wickedness within the human race, God looks down and he says, it's not going to happen anymore. Not going to happen anymore. He limits the lifespan of human beings and says they're not going to live any more than 120 years. And while those long lifespans that we see in the Old Testament continue on for a little while, you do see some of these long lifespans in the early days, but the further you go in the Old Testament, the shorter those lifespans get. And by the time you get to the end of the first 5 books of the Bible, the books of Moses, Moses dies at, you got it, right at 120 years. Right at 120 years. And it fits with our experience as well. Because you think of the oldest person you can think of. A few years ago, I saw a news story about these two ladies who were the oldest two human beings on the planet at the time, and both of them were 116 years old. You don't find anybody much older than that these days. Okay, now here's another bizarre part. What is this Nephilim? The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came into the daughters of men and bore children to them. Who are the Nephilim? Is this talking about these sons of God? Is it talking about the children that were born from these intermixed relationships between angels and human beings? The Nephilim, what is this? Well, literally, the word Nephilim, it comes from the word Nephal, which means to fall, so it would be the fallen ones. Literally, the Hebrew word would mean the fallen ones. The Greek translation of the Old Testament, the Septuagint is what that's called, it translated the Nephilim as giants. And there's two places in the Old Testament that we see this word for Nephilim, which is often translated giants. The other place, I think, is what gives us the clue to understand who these Nephilim are. In Numbers chapter 13, Moses sends the spies into the promised land to check the land out to say, is this good land? Are we going to be able to come in and take it? And the 12 spies come back. You've got Joshua and Caleb who say, yes, let's go. Let's take the land. Whereas the other 10 spies, what they come back saying? Boy, they got big grapes and everything, but, there's the Nephilim there. That's what they say. The Nephilim are there, and we are like grasshoppers in their sight. Which is probably, since this word is only used 2 times in the Old Testament, that's probably why they translated giants. Because the spies that went into the land, we see from there, they saw themselves as grasshoppers in the sight of these people they called the Nephilim. Now, what does that have to do with this passage? I think what Moses is doing here, whenever he writes this, is he's the one who writes Genesis through Deuteronomy, and he's the one who wrote about, he's the one who was leading the children of Israel at that time, and what he's doing here is he's saying, the Nephilim were on the earth in those days. What days is that? In the days that these fallen angels came down and had intermarriages between them and human women. So the Nephilim were there both before this happened and after it happened. The effect of that is saying to his original readers, to the ones who were going to be going into the promised land, you don't have to worry about these Nephilim. They're not some kind of demigods like you see in Greek literature of these like Zeus and some human woman having a child. No, they're not like that. They're not some product of the gods or anything like that. They're just human beings. They were there both before the sons of God came down and after. And so since they were both there before and after, we know these Nephilim, they didn't come from this intermarriage. The Nephilim themselves, or the sons of God, the children that would come from those relationships, they were destroyed in the flood. They were destroyed. They roamed around. So, I'm going to back up again. I say all that. I think that is an interpretation that makes sense. It makes sense of the text. It makes sense of the data. But at the same time, this is something that is a difficult text, and I think we should be gracious and not divisive over how we come down on how to interpret this text. If you think, well, it just doesn't make sense to me. You think it's the godly line of Seth and the wicked line of Cain. That's fine. It is not something to divide about. But I think that's what does make the best sense of the text. Now, verse 5, we get to this next part. It says, now the Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great upon the earth, and that every intention of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. That was the condition of human beings at the time. We saw the spread of sin, where sin entered into the world by just eating a fruit. And it seems so innocent to us. But the spread of that, it went to where in the very next generation you see murder. And each generation just seems to get worse and worse and worse until finally you get to the time of Noah, and it says, every intention of the thoughts of the heart were only evil continually. That's all day long, every hour, every minute, only thinking about evil. Just when they go to bed at night, what kind of evil am I going to do the next day? When they get up in the morning, they go, oh, what am I going to do today that's going to be evil? That's the kind of only evil continually. And I say that, and if not for the grace of God, that's where we would all be. If it were not for the grace of God, if it were not for a change that He would bring about in our hearts, if it were not for His preserving spirit within the world, that is where we would all be. We would all be just like these ancient people who were only thinking of evil and wicked all the time. Verse 6 says, and the Lord regretted that He made man upon the earth, and it grieved Him to His heart. So the Lord said, I will blot out man whom I have created from the face of the land, man and animals and creeping things and birds of the heavens, for I am sorry that I have made them. Now, this brings up the question. It says, the Lord regretted that He had made man upon the earth. Regretted. Does God regret things? Does God change His mind? It says in the last verse, I am sorry that I've made them. Is this indicating that God changed His mind? I don't believe so. God is, He does what He pleases. He is sovereign and He is in control. And He does not change His mind. Later on, in other scriptures, I don't have the text, the reference to the text off the top of my head at the moment, but it says, God is not a man to change His mind. He's not like we are to be fickle and just be changing our mind all the time. No, God is not like that. He does not change His mind. He has settled His purpose, and He will do what He has determined to do. But I think that what this is a kind of a phenomenological language. It's describing how it appears to us when God He hurts, He's saddened. He really is hurt and pained of the fact that human being have become so evil and wicked. And so He decides He is going to wipe out all of humanity in a flood that is going to come. Then we see verse 8, and here is the ray of hope in this passage. But Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. That word for favor is the word for grace. Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. When there's nothing in here that tells us that Noah was different from all the other people there. That everybody else that was only thinking of evil constantly all the time. The text doesn't tell us that Noah was different here. Instead, it tells us Noah found grace. He didn't get what he deserved. He got a gift. He got something he didn't deserve. Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. It is only by grace. It is only by His free gift of mercy. It is only by Thy mercy, like we sang, that we can be saved, that we can have a relationship with God. We have all gone our own way, just like Ecclesiastes tells us. God created man upright, but they've all found their own devices. We have all gone our own way. We all, like sheep, have gone astray. And it is by His grace that we can be saved. Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. And what can we look at in Noah? When we say that he was saved by grace, I don't think it's anything that was particularly good in him. It was perfectly grace. But one thing we can look at is he had faith. He had faith. Now, I think God picked him out. God gave him that faith. It wouldn't have been, he was just like everybody else, and it was only God's grace that was able to enable him to have that faith. But God came to him and He told him, build an ark. And Noah's like, what's an ark? What's raining? What is this? You're telling me a flood is going to come? And all the years that Noah went into building that ark and his wife. Why do you keep bringing home these bills for lumber, Noah? think of what he had to put up with his wife asking, Noah, you're crazy. But Noah believed God. That is the picture of faith that we see. The faith is someone who's believing God, and in spite of everybody else thinking he was crazy, he believed what God was telling him. And we see the same kind of pattern when we come to Abraham. Abraham, it tells us that he had to go up the mountain, and he was told to sacrifice his son. And Abraham believed God, so he went up on that mountain, and he was just about ready to sacrifice his son, and God stopped him, and he provided a lamb. He provided a ram that was stuck in the thicket. This is the same pattern we see. It's someone who believes God. And notice, we're not going to turn there right now, but you can go back and look in your own Bibles. The passage that tells us Abraham believed God and it was credited to him as righteousness happened before that test where Abraham had to take Isaac up on the mountain. He believed God before that ever had even happened. And he was credited as righteous even before he took his son up on the mountain. All of this points forward to the fact that salvation is by grace through faith alone. That salvation is by grace through faith alone, and it is faith in that person, that faith in that one who Genesis 3 tells us about, who was the seed of the woman, who was going to come, who was Jesus Christ, who came, he lived a perfect, sinless life, and he died upon a cross, he rose again, and we can have life in him. So all of that to say, I'm winding down now. These things are written for our instructions. And even though some things are difficult, and even though some things seem to blow our minds, we're like, how? I can't even understand that. It is all God's Word, and it is meant for our instructions. And even this passage here, that we look at and we think is so bizarre, it points us to the gospel. It points us to the fact that we are saved by grace in that promised seed that is to come.